1937. A small town in central Japan. A 29-year-old mechanic in oil-stained clothes stands outside a factory gate, reading a letter for the third time. The letter is from Toyota. It says his design has been rejected. He is not qualified. He should give up. The mechanic folds the letter into his pocket. He walks home. He does not cry. He does not complain. He has been told he is not good enough since he was 6 years old. 40 years later, the company that bears his name will outsell Toyota in motorcycles, dominate American racetracks, beat General Motors at engineering, and put a Honda engine in over 400 million machines around the world. But on this afternoon in 1937, Soichiro Honda has nothing. No money, no engineering degree, no factory, no future. This is the story of how the poorest boy in his village built one of the most powerful companies on Earth, and how he was almost destroyed 3 separate times before he ever sold a single car. In the next 15 minutes, you'll discover why Toyota rejected him, not once, but twice. The wartime disaster that nearly killed him along with his entire factory. The strange decision he made at age 41 that everyone in Japan thought was insane. The partnership with a stranger that saved his company, and the single word he banned from his factory before he built the engine that defeated General Motors. You'll also discover why, at the height of his power, he refused to hand the company to his own son. You're watching Biomystery Media. Subscribe, because the real story of Soichiro Honda is nothing like the man on the company website. Soichiro Honda was born on November 17, 1906, in a village called Komyo, in Shizuoka Prefecture, Japan. His father, Gihei Honda, was a blacksmith who repaired bicycles on the side to bring in extra money. His mother, Mika, was a weaver who worked from dawn until well past dark. There were 9 children in the family. 4 of them would die before reaching adulthood, most of disease, one of starvation. The Hondas lived in a wooden house with dirt floors. There was no electricity. There was no running water. Soichiro later said that one of his earliest memories was the smell of metal and oil from his father's workshop. He said it was the smell of safety, the smell of his father working. He hated school from the day he started. Teachers described him as inattentive, restless, and stubborn. His grades were so poor that, according to his own later admissions, he forged the family seal on his report cards so his parents wouldn't see them. He stole rice from neighbors. He picked fights. When the principal eventually discovered the forgery, he summoned Gihei Honda to the school and told him, in front of his son, "This boy will never amount to anything. He should learn a trade and be grateful." Gihei took Soichiro home and beat him with a bamboo cane. But the next morning, something strange happened. Gihei sat his son down and said, very quietly, "The principal is wrong. You will be whatever you decide to be, but you will have to work harder than any boy in this village, because no one will help you." Soichiro Honda would later say that those were the most important words anyone ever spoke to him. And then, when he was around 8 years old, an automobile drove through his village. It was the first car he had ever seen. He chased it down the dirt road for nearly a mile, and when it finally stopped, he knelt down on his hands and knees and smelled the oil dripping from the engine onto the ground. He pressed his fingers into the oil. He brought them to his face. He later wrote that, in that moment, he knew exactly what he wanted to do with the rest of his life. And at age 15, with no diploma, no connections, and a single cloth bag, he left home for Tokyo to become an apprentice mechanic. His mother packed him 3 rice balls for the train. He would not return home for 10 years. The shop he joined was called Art Shokai. It was owned by a man named Yuzo Sakakibara, who took Soichiro on as the youngest apprentice in the company. For the first 6 months, Sakakibara didn't let him touch a single car. His only job was to look after the owner's baby. Soichiro would later say those 6 months were the most humiliating of his life. He watched the other apprentices laugh at him. He listened to engines he wasn't allowed to touch. He fed and rocked a child while everything he had traveled across Japan to learn happened 10 feet away. But he didn't quit. He watched. He memorized every tool, every sound, every routine. He stayed after closing time to clean the shop just so he could be near the cars after everyone went home. And when Sakakibara finally, let him touch an engine, he turned out to be something close to a prodigy. Within 3 years, he had become Art Shokai's most skilled mechanic. By age 22, he had opened his own branch of the shop in his home prefecture of Hamamatsu. By 24, he was personally designing and building race cars. Because here's what almost no one mentions about young Soichiro Honda. He was obsessed with speed. Friends described him as wild, drinking heavily, brawling in bars, racing other young men through the streets of Hamamatsu at 3 in the morning, chasing women, gambling money he didn't have. He once jumped out of a second-story window of a brothel to escape a police raid and broke his ankle in the fall. He laughed about it in interviews decades later. But all of that wildness fed into one thing. He wanted to build the fastest car in Japan. In 1936, he drove one of his own designs in the All Japan Speed Rally. He was 29 years old. His brother, Benjiro, rode beside him as co-driver. He was leading the race when he crashed at over 75 miles per hour. The car flipped multiple times across the dirt track. Benjiro was thrown from the vehicle and seriously injured. Soichiro's face was crushed. His left shoulder was dislocated. His wrist was shattered. He bit through his own tongue. He spent 3 months in the hospital. The doctors told him he would never race again. They were right about racing, but not about ambition. Lying in that hospital bed, Soichiro made a decision that would change everything. He would stop driving cars and start building the things that cars were made of. Specifically, he would build the one component every car in Japan still imported from abroad, the piston ring. He sold his auto shop. He used the money to start a tiny company called Tokai Seiki Heavy Industry. He spent every yen he had, and many he didn't, trying to perfect a single piston ring that could meet Toyota's specifications. It took him 3 years. When he finally submitted 50 sample rings to Toyota's quality inspectors in 1941, 47 of them were rejected as defective. Only 3 passed. Soichiro Honda was now 33 years old. He had no money, no formal training, a failed first attempt, and he had just been told, in writing, that he wasn't good enough. So he did something almost no Japanese man of his age did at that time. He went back to school. At an age when most Japanese men were established in their careers, Soichiro Honda enrolled in the Hamamatsu School of Technology as a part-time student. He told the dean he wasn't interested in a diploma. He only wanted the knowledge he was missing. He sat in the back of classrooms next to students 15 years younger than him. He took notes on metallurgy, chemistry, mechanical engineering. He skipped any lecture he felt was irrelevant to his work, which infuriated his professors so much that they eventually expelled him for refusing to take exams. Soichiro didn't care. He had what he came for. 2 years later, he had figured out exactly what had gone wrong with his piston rings. He redesigned the manufacturing process from scratch. He resubmitted to Toyota. This time, they accepted his designs. By 1942, Soichiro's tiny piston ring factory was supplying parts directly to Toyota for use in Japanese military vehicles. He owned 40% of Tokai Seiki. He had hired over 2,000 employees. He had a wife, Sachi, and a young family. He had finally arrived. He was 36 years old. He was successful. He was respected. He had no idea that within 3 years, almost everything he had built would be destroyed. In November 1944, American B-29 bombers conducted a raid on the city of Yamashita. Soichiro Honda's main factory was destroyed in a single night. Workers died. Equipment was reduced to twisted metal. The factory floor, the floor he had walked across every morning for years, was now a crater filled with smoking debris. He rebuilt it in weeks. A few months later, a second bombing raid destroyed it again. More workers killed. More machinery lost. He rebuilt it a second time. Then, on January 13th, 1945, the Mikawa earthquake, one of the most destructive earthquakes in modern Japanese history, struck Shizuoka Prefecture with a magnitude of 6.8. It killed over 2,000 people across the region, and it leveled what was left of Soichiro Honda's factory. 3 disasters in less than a year. Soichiro walked through the rubble of his life's work and made a decision. He would sell what little remained of Tokai Seiki to Toyota for 450,000 yen, roughly the price of a modest house at that time. He took the money home to his wife. And then, in his own words, he spent an entire year doing nothing. He drank heavily. He played the shakuhachi flute. He gardened. He told his neighbors that he was finished with industry forever. He was 39 years old. He had been broken 3 times in 3 years. The war was lost. The country was in ruins. His employees were scattered. His factory was dust. Most men would have stayed broken. Soichiro Honda's wife Sachi later said that during this period he barely spoke. He sat in the garden for hours. He stared at the sky. She thought she had lost him. In 1946, Japan was a country in ruins. Cities were rubble. There was no gasoline because there were no refineries. There were no cars on the roads because there was no fuel to drive them. Public transportation had collapsed. Women in particular had no way to get to markets or hospitals or to find food for their children. Soichiro noticed something that no one else seemed to be paying attention to. The Japanese military had abandoned warehouses full of small 2-stroke engines, engines originally designed to power radio generators for wartime communications. They were sitting unused, rusting in the rain. He bought 500 of them. Then, in a tiny rented workshop in Hamamatsu, 16 feet by 16 feet, with no electricity for the first 3 months, he and a handful of employees began strapping these tiny engines onto used bicycles. His friends thought he had lost his mind. Japan was starving. The economy had collapsed. The American occupation was rationing food. And a 40-year-old former factory owner was bolting wartime radio engines onto used bicycles in a shack with a dirt floor. When the gasoline ran out, and it did frequently, Soichiro began distilling fuel himself from pine tree resin. The bicycles smoked. They smelled like a forest fire. They were ugly, loud, and unreliable. But every single one of them sold. Within 6 months, every motorized bicycle he produced had been bought. Women across central Japan were riding them to markets. Soichiro had stumbled into the perfect product at the perfect moment in history. So he started making his own engines. In 1948, he registered a new company. He named it Honda Motor Company. He had 34 employees and almost no capital. And then, in 1949, he met the man who would save his company. His name was Takeo Fujisawa. Fujisawa was a businessman, sharp, ruthless, calculating. Everything Soichiro Honda was not. Soichiro was the engineer who would walk through fire to perfect a single component. Fujisawa was the strategist who understood markets, dealers, financing, distribution. The two men met through a mutual friend, and within minutes agreed to a partnership that would last 40 years. They made a verbal agreement. Soichiro would never touch the finances. Fujisawa would never touch the engineering. They would never tell each other how to do their jobs. They shook hands. They did not sign a contract. 40 years later, when they retired together on the same day in 1973, they had still never signed one. What followed over the next decade was one of the most aggressive industrial expansions in Japanese history. In 1959, Honda entered the world's most prestigious motorcycle race, the Isle of Man Tourist Trophy, for the first time. The European press laughed at the Japanese team. Honda's first finish was 6th place. 5 years later, Honda was winning the race. By the early 1960s, Honda was the largest motorcycle manufacturer in the world. But Soichiro had a bigger ambition. He wanted to make cars. The Japanese government tried to stop him. In the early 1960s, Japan's Ministry of International Trade and Industry, known as MITI, was attempting to consolidate the entire Japanese auto industry into just 2 or 3 large companies, Toyota, Nissan, and perhaps one other. They informed Soichiro Honda in writing that he would not be permitted to enter the automobile market. Soichiro's response was, reportedly, to hell with the government. He launched his first car anyway. The Honda T360 truck went on sale in June 1963. The Honda S500 sports car followed in October. But the real challenge was still ahead. In 1970, the United States passed the Clean Air Act. It demanded that every new car sold in America by 1975 dramatically reduce its emissions. The big 3 American automakers, General Motors, Ford, Chrysler, declared it impossible. The president of General Motors testified before Congress that the law could not be met without destroying the American auto industry. Toyota said it would take a decade. Soichiro's own engineers told him, privately, that they could not do it. The word they used was muri. In Japanese, it means impossible. Soichiro Honda banned the word from his factory. He told his engineers that anyone who used the word in his presence would be dismissed from the project. He told them that muri was a word for people who had already given up. 3 years later, in 1973, Honda unveiled the CVCC engine. It was the first engine in the world to meet the Clean Air Act standards, without a catalytic converter, the workaround that every American manufacturer was relying on. The American giants had to license the technology from Honda. A poor boy from a village with dirt roads had just beaten General Motors at their own game. Here's what almost no one outside Japan knows about Soichiro Honda. He never appointed his own son to succeed him. In a country where family-run corporations were the rule, where a founder's children inherited the empire as a matter of tradition, Soichiro Honda made a deliberate, public, and shocking decision. His son Hirotoshi would never run Honda Motor Company. None of his children would. None of his nephews. None of his relatives. Soichiro himself stepped down as president in October 1973, at the height of Honda's American triumph, just weeks after the CVCC announcement. He was 66 years old. He named a non-family successor, a Honda employee named Kiyoshi Kawashima. On the same day, his partner Takeo Fujisawa also retired. They walked out of the building together. Soichiro spent the rest of his life refusing to use his own influence inside the company. He never sat in on a board meeting after his retirement. When his son, Hirotoshi, later started a Honda parts modification business of his own, Soichiro publicly distanced himself from it. When asked why he refused to give his family the company, he said, "My family did not build this company. The people who work here did. To hand it to my son would be a theft from them." But there's one more detail, something quieter. Even after his retirement, Soichiro Honda would occasionally appear unannounced at Honda dealerships around Japan. He would walk in, wearing his factory uniform, the same one he had worn for 40 years. He would bow to every mechanic in the building. He would shake their hands. He would thank them, by name, for their work. He never gave speeches at these visits. He never made announcements. He just bowed and left. Soichiro Honda died on August 5, 1991, at the age of 84. At the request of his family, there was no large state funeral. Instead, the company organized something different. Honda dealerships across Japan held simultaneous memorial gatherings on the same day. Mechanics in oil-stained uniforms stood in silence beside the engines he had designed. There were no politicians, no celebrities, no government officials, just the people who had built the cars. It was exactly what he would have wanted. Soichiro Honda's story isn't really about cars. It's about what happens when a man is told, at every single stage of his life, that he is not enough, not smart enough for school, not skilled enough for Toyota the first time, not lucky enough to survive the war, not connected enough to start over at 40, not allowed by his government to even try to make a car. He failed every one of those tests on the first attempt, and he simply refused to accept the result. We remember Soichiro Honda not because he built a company. Plenty of men have built companies, and most of their names we have forgotten. We remember him because he kept building. After the bombs fell, after the earthquake came, after the rejections piled up, after the government tried to stop him, after his own engineers said the word impossible. The poor boy from Komyo never stopped chasing the car that drove through his village. And that, in the end, is the only difference between the people we forget and the people whose names we put on engines. Next week on Biomystery Media, we're telling the story of a man who became the richest person in America and then locked himself in a darkened hotel room for 15 years, refusing to cut his hair or his fingernails until the day he died. His name was Howard Hughes. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss it. Until then, every life hides a story, and we're going to keep telling them.